One of the key things that's very important in not just your research papers, but in any sort of communication that you do in ministry or just in general, is to make sure that you're communicating clearly. It is difficult sometimes to communicate clearly orally because sometimes your brain gets working faster than your mouth does. Sometimes you struggle to find the right words if you don't have exactly written down what you want to specifically say. When it comes to a paper, though, it's a little bit easier because it's all right there in front of you. You can review it, you can look at it, and you can run it by somebody else, for example, to see what they think. And so communicating clearly should theoretically be easier when it comes to presenting a written project like a research paper that we're talking about. Of course, predominantly we're focusing here on research papers, written presentations of research, as opposed to other types of presentations. When it comes to constructing the paper, probably in high school and other classes that you've had in college, you've probably had at some point some sort of discussion about how to construct an essay, whether that's been in Comp 1 and 2, or again, some high school setting, etc. And so there might be a variety of ways that you've been taught how to construct and produce a paper. But essentially when you think about producing a paper, I'm not going to tell you exactly all the ins and outs of how you should do it, but there are a couple of things that you should have present that you probably already know, but it's good to refresh. First of all is an introduction. There needs to be some section of your paper right there at the beginning that establishes what you are going to be talking about. Something that kind of establishes what it is you will be arguing. Remember, in the papers, especially research papers, you want to have some sort of claim or argument that you're making, and so that should be set up in your introduction. Of course, a sizable part of what you'll be writing is the body of the paper, the support of the claims that you're making, the evidence that demonstrates what you are talking about, and then finally, a conclusion that ties it all together. And so in a way, you can think of it like this. You start off by saying what you will say. The introduction sets it up. This is what I'm going to talk about. The body, of course, is actually saying it. And then finally, say what you said. So here's what I'm going to say. Here's me saying it. Here's what I said. Very simplistic, yes, but it's important to kind of think about how those things are important to move your reader along to see what it is that you're trying to claim. And within all of that, of course, is the importance of transitions. Transitions are very important so that as your reader is following you in your paper, that they can understand what it is you are trying to say. We talked about last week in argument construction how that evidence doesn't always speak for itself. It rarely ever speaks for itself. And often how you are thinking about specific evidence doesn't necessarily demonstrate it to everybody who might read your paper. Transitions help move you across or try to eliminate the possibility of your audience getting lost. Whether that is something as simple as there are three main arguments about this particular passage. First, right, here's one argument. Second, here's another argument. Third, here's another argument. And so it can be those kind of numerical lists that lay out the information. It could be phrases like additionally or in contrast, things like that that help your reader understand how this material works together. Now, of course, part of that has to do with including what it is you're adding to the table. What is it that you're bringing to those aspects, or this particular paper. In thinking about your introduction, one thing that might come out is that as you're going through your paper, there might be something that was particularly interesting to you. You thought, wow, this is something I've never heard before. Great. Hopefully that happens. But in starting your introduction, avoid questions. That's one of the things that is most, is not really going to help you start off your paper. Now, you should have some sort of attention-grabbing statement, right? Something that is going to draw your reader in. Okay, I want to know more about what you have to say. But while a question may work in a devo, right, or a sermon, right, have you ever thought about whether or not passages in the Bible belong there? It doesn't work as well in an academic scholarly type of setting. And so while you want something that is going to interest your reader, avoid those kind of questions that will, essentially kind of already turn a scholarly or an academic audience off. Because if you start out with a question like, have you ever thought such and such? The person says, no. Where do you go from there? Does the person particularly care to think about that? Have you ever been? No. So questions aren't a good way to start off a paper while they might be in other types of situations. So your introduction should attempt to get the interest of the reader. Your introduction should set up what you're going to say. And it should also kind of suggest the importance. Why is this an important topic? Why is this something that the reader should take the time to read? Now again, yes, probably most of the things that you produce in college, your reader is going to have to read because they need to grade it. And probably the only person that is going to read most of your papers, unless you submit it somewhere and give it to other people, is probably going to be the professor. Most of the times we do our research papers, we're not interested in sharing that particular research paper with friends or family members. So yes, in a sense, the only person that's going to be reading it is your professor, and your professor has to read it because she or he has to grade it. It's still better to read an interesting paper than it is to read a boring paper as a professor, right? So even though I have to read your paper, it's always good to kind of think about, tell me what's important about this. Why is this an interesting thing that I should read this paper with the desire to discover what your thoughts are about it, instead of I'm just reading this because I have to read it. Because if you think about that for your research papers, then also think about that for other types of communication you're going to need to do, written communication or oral communication. Gaining attention of your audience is very important. Investing them in what it is you're talking about, and then also interesting them in what it is you have to say. Why should I continue to listen to you instead of tune you out? A very important part of your introduction should be your thesis statement. The thesis statement is your argument, your claim in miniature. This is the guiding part of the entire rest of your paper. Everything that you write after your thesis statement should be connected to that thesis statement in one way or another. If you cannot figure out how it relates to that thesis statement, it probably does not belong there. So it could be evidence in support of your thesis statement. It could be evidence that people might say would contradict your thesis statement. But there shouldn't be a section of your paper where, as the person's reading along, they suddenly go, what does this have to do with anything you're talking about? So developing that thesis statement is very, very important. Now, it might not come off right at the top of, as you sit down to write your paper. Developing a good thesis statement might require you to begin writing and thinking, and then, oh, okay, here's how I can put this in such a way. But there are a couple of things to think about when it comes to a thesis statement. What are the components that make up a good thesis statement? First of all, a thesis statement should be concise. It is your argument in miniature. So you should be able to state within a sentence or two what it is you'll be demonstrating in your paper. The paper, 2,500 words, is minimum, so that is about 10 pages. You should be able to summarize a 10-page paper and the argument of a 10-page paper in a sentence or two. So it should be concise. It shouldn't be including all sorts of information about everything in your paper, but it should be concise. So secondly, a good thesis statement is explicit, meaning that, number one, the reader should be able to point to a sentence or two in your introduction and say, this is what this paper is all about. Second, it should also be explicit in the way in which you are clearly articulating what it is you will be arguing, not just, I will discuss this particular passage. I will look at three interesting facts about this passage. Those, first of all, those aren't good arguments. Second of all, those aren't good thesis statements because you haven't clearly and explicitly articulated. Third, a good thesis statement should be clear. I should understand exactly what it is you will be arguing. You should be able to express in just a few words the overall point of your paper in such a way that a person can understand what it is you plan on arguing. Fourth, a good thesis statement is comprehensive. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that within the context of that sentence or two, you have laid out your claim, you have briefly given some sort of, you've pointed to the evidence that supports your claim, and you have essentially laid out the structure of your paper. So a good thesis statement covers all of that in just a sentence or two. It's comprehensive in that it summarizes the rest of your paper. Again, a thesis statement should be identifiable, should be able to point to it very easily. It is a summary of your paper. It includes a summary of the evidence you will be using. But then finally, it also, as I've said before, gives your paper focus. It helps you discover and it helps you clearly figure out how you should organize the rest of your paper. Now again, you might not develop that thesis statement right off the top of your head. It might be something that you have to go back to after you've written some. But at some point in the construction of your paper, you should have a thesis statement that helps you figure out how you organize the rest of your information in your paper. That you're able to block it out. Right? This is what I need to talk about first, this is what I need to talk about second, this is what I need to talk about third, and here's how I'm going to finish up.